How's it going, everyone? This is Mel here. I'm in the beautiful city of Budapest as part of my summer cycle. I've interrupted my break to bring you this video. It's to do with Dan Gibson. It probably appears I have a problem with Dan Gibson, but I'm a real stickler for uh, fact checking things and not um, just accepting what someone says just because they're a nice guy. And I hope that is the same in your uh, attitude to my channel or any other channel. It doesn't matter, personalities are irrelevant. Um, Historical research is all about science and about facts and accurate information. So there's a whole host of issues at the minute that I see I need to respond to because of a new book coming out by Dan Gibson. Um, and I think it's the work he's doing is going to set back the whole field by 30 or 40 years. It's a massive distraction. Um, the only part of it that is worth considering is the apparent convergence of Qiblas towards Petra. That part, I acknowledge there's probably something in that and it's worth investigating, but obviously the periphery stuff is actually just as important because that's where the narrative comes from. Was Petra a pagan city, as Dan Gibson would suggest, predominantly pagan? He suggests it was 75% pagan. I dispute that. I've had discussions with him from 3 or 4 years ago by emails. I've sent him lots of information and he's just not really taken it on board. We've had a back and forth on this. I think his core idea that Petra was predominantly a pagan city in the 7th century is fundamentally mistaken. It's wrong, and there's a ton of evidence that disproves that. If I were to say to you that on the basis that the Roman form in Rome that exists is predominantly pagan, if you went to the archaeology and counted up all the different pagan temples and then concluded that Rome is currently a pagan city, you immediately realize there's something wrong with that. You can't just go to Petra, count up the number of pagan temples, count up the number of churches and go, oh, there's more pagan temples, so therefore it's predominantly a a pagan city in the 7th century. Obviously the dating is important, but you also have to look at the sources and what was happening in the background in the centuries leading up to the 7th century. So I'm going to be looking at a paper with you. I've made some notes and it's called, and your apologies, I'm going to be looking down. I don't have a teleprompter like fancy people like Islam Critiqued or anything, or other people like that, so bear with me. So it's called From Paganism to Christianity, General Remarks on Petra, the 1st to the 6th century AD, ResearchGate, and the university is connected to Al Hussein bin Talal University 2018, and the person who wrote it, unfortunately I haven't written down, Mohammed something or other. Let me see if I've written it down here before I get started. Not terrible, I didn't write that down. Oh, I did. Mohammed al-Nasiri. Mohammed al-Nasiri. So that's the paper. I have to say I like his paper. I think it's very fair. There's no craziness going on. It's very level-headed. I don't know if the guy is a Christian or Muslim, but just judging from his name Mohammed, I presume he's Muslim, but he's very rational, very fair paper. He doesn't make any exaggerated claims, and everything is backed up with citations and lots of great sources. Now I've tried to extract the essence of a 29-page paper and tried to reduce it down to the best I could to about 5 pages of notes here. So I'll try my best, and obviously I will give my thoughts as we go as well. So Dan Gibson has concluded on the basis of pagan ruins in Petra that only 25% of the population there were Christian at the beginning of the 7th century. I've already mentioned that this conclusion is akin to going to the Roman Forum today and concluding the majority of Romans are still pagan or under a Caesar. On the contrary, I agree with a paper by Muhammad al-Nasiri that pagans in Petra were a tiny minority at that time. Tiny minority. He says, quote, crucially, the advent of Christianity in the 4th century AD did not lead to the eradication of paganism from the minds and culture of the people. Rather, paganism continued to exist in the ensuing centuries, even after the destruction of the pagan buildings in Petra due to the earthquake of 363 AD and the demise of the last Byzantine emperor who supported paganism, Julian. Such a situation is reflected in the Christian sources which speak about the existence of certain pagan elements and sects that still practice their rituals until a very late time in Petra. This is tantamount to the survival of a minority of pagans who managed to preserve their ancient religion. It seems that there were a small number of Bedouin Saracens who were not under the control of the Byzantine Empire, especially during the 6th century AD. So do you hear what he's saying? He's not saying that there was a majority of pagans in the 7th century. What he's saying is that paganism did persist. That's fine. I've no problems with that. But he's saying that he refers to the survival of a minority of pagans who managed to preserve their ancient religion. And he refers to a small number of Bedouin Saracens. Okay, so we're kind of starting with the conclusion. That's the point he makes in the paper, which is diametrically even the opposite to what Dan Gibson is saying. So who's right here? Dan Gibson, who says 75% of Petra were still pagan in the 7th century, or this writer who says there were only a small number of Bedouin Saracens who were still pagans. I go with the latter. The evidence stacks up completely on the side of the argument that there was only a tiny minority of pagans. And we can look at historical sources, we can look at archaeological surveys. Now it's interesting, I recently put up some messages under Bob the Builder's fascinating video interview with Dan Gibson that was out this last week, and I put up a couple of challenges. One of the challenges being that Dan Gibson has identified the Qasr al-Bent altar as the supposed Kaaba of his thesis in Petra. Problem with that is it depends on al-Azraqi, writing 2 centuries later, who's a mythicist at the best, that his measurements are not a fantasy. Al-Azraqi never mentions Petra by name, so all Dan Gibson has to go by is that the dimensions of this altar, which is an auxiliary building next to the temple itself, that the dimensions match exactly. But as I pointed out under the video, is that there have been a team of archaeologists that have been working on that site for 20 years and more, and they published many papers. In fact, I'll leave some screenshots of the ground plans. Now they're not the particular paper I've got. On holidays, I'm working off a phone, so this is not the ideal situation. I have another paper on my computer at home, but the only paper I could find with reasonably good ground plans. Those images I will post at the end of this video so you can have a look and you can work it out for yourself. But according to Dan Gibson, there's 4 different sides to this building, so they're not all the same. They're 4 totally different sizes. Now, regardless of the sizes, from the ground plan, even if you ignore dimensions and conversions of units and so on, you can see that there's a Roman altar there at the next to the Kaiser al-Bent. The opposite sides are the same. So if one side is 4, the other side is 4. If one side is 8, the other side is 8. So there's two pairs of sizes. The problem is they don't match al-Azraqi's dimensions. Now, Dan Gibson has said that he's been to the site, or sorry, to be more precise, he hasn't actually said that he measured it on site, but what he said is that he has measured the site on, he's measured this Kaaba or altar. Actually, I should put Kaaba, or actually the Roman altar, several times. Now, I don't know what he used. Did he measure it in person? Did he measure it using Google Earth? We all know what the problem with measuring something with very small dimensions via Google Earth, that is not the way to go, especially when millimeters matter if you're making an argument, with the only evidence being the size of it. If your argument is that this matches with al-Azraqi, you have to be 100% accurate. What was surprising is he asked me for the names of the archaeologists who were working on the site so that he could look at the paper, and it took me, when I went looking for the dimensions for the site when I first saw this 2 years ago, it took me all of about maybe an hour to find who the archaeologists were, and where I could find the dimensions of it. And I had to go through a few papers, but eventually found one of their papers where the ground plan was there. And it doesn't take a genius to work out the dimensions from it, because there's a scale, and you can measure off the dimensions, and it does not match al-Azraqi's dimensions. Now, Dan Gibson does give the dimensions on his channel. Now, off the top of my head, I haven't got them to hand, but maybe I'll put it in the comment below. But anyway, I'm slightly going off on a little tangent there, but that is part of the reason why the question of whether there was a minority or majority of Christians in the 7th century is important, because the idea that Dan Gibson is trying to build in his narrative is that there was a pagan culture in the early part of the 7th century with a tiny minority of Christians, which matches perfectly with the Islamic narrative, and this pagan temple, this Kaaba-like structure, was used by the Petrans to circumambulate even. One of the things he never mentions is the fact it's built on a slope, which is, I remember my uncle once talking about going to a wedding where the marquee was built on a slope, and he was dancing uphill, trying to swirl people around uphill. So you can imagine, if someone was building a site for circumambulation, would you not level the site off? It's not that difficult, but it's on a slope, and you can actually go and look at the videos, but it doesn't seem to see that. And there's also the other fact that there's steps coming out of the temple, a space, and then steps going into the altar. So the people circumambulated would have to watch their feet so they don't trip on the steps in between as they go around. Anyway, don't mean to mock, but you know, a bit of common sense. There's multiple counterfactual information there that you could easily see that this idea of circumambulation around this altar, when really is a non-starter, when really all that was happening was prior to the earthquake in 363 AD, it had been used as a pagan site, and animals were sacrificed in the altar, or on the altar, to service the temple. Okay, so back to the paper then. What's not in doubt is that in the 4th century BC, the Nabateans settled in Petra and worshipped there. And what did they worship? They worshipped Alat, Aluza, Manat, Dushara, and Shay al-Qawm, the god who hates drinking wine. Okay? Now that's the 4th century BC, so don't get confused. We're not talking about the 7th century. The temple of Qasr al-Bent was the most famous temple in Petra and meant for the worship of Dushara. Now this is the one that Dan Gibson is banking on as being the site for the original Kaaba. It is likely that when St. Paul wrote to the Galatians of going into Arabia, he was referring to spending time amongst the Nabateans, a period of 2 to 3 years, in which it is highly probable that Petra would have been one of the locations he spent time at. When King Aretas IV discovered Paul's missionary activity, he ordered his governor to have him killed. This indicates that Paul was not particularly successful amongst the Arabs at that time, and the religion was entering the Nabatean kingdom at a slow pace. In other words, Christianity didn't suddenly take off after St. Paul's mission. Okay, so the Nabateans weren't all that quick to become Christians. That's fair enough. We're still talking 1st century AD, bear that in mind. In the transition from paganism to Christianity in the Byzantine Empire, to quote the paper, paganism was an essential force in the Byzantine society, and therefore pagans were allowed to coexist with Christians at the beginning of the transition to maintain social unity within the state. Thus, paganism was found in Petra side by side with Christianity during the 4th century AD, and this state continued until the 5th century AD. So, just to be clear, 4th century, the year 300 AD up to 399, alright? So, this existed from the 4th century to the 5th century. We're still 2 centuries before the time that Dan Gibson says that there was 75% of the population of Petra were Christian. Okay, so the Byzantine period of 324 to 636 AD was the most important time spans of intensive human settlement in the region. Eusebius describes Petra during this period as the noble city. He discusses the construction of churches in the area in the period 324 to 337 AD. So this is 4 centuries before Petra was said to be a majority city. Okay, so 4 centuries before churches are being built, and yet 4 centuries later, somehow Christianity is still representing only 25% of the population, according to Dan Gibson. Okay. Now, what Eusebius says, he's not entirely positive about the city. He says it's a noble city, but he also characterizes the city as full of superstitions and the works of demons. Okay, so he has some good things and some bad things to say about it. Church historian Theodoros, 393 to 458 AD, states that the bishop of Petra, Asterius, rejected the ideas put forward by the followers of Arius and was banished to Libya by Emperor Constantius II. Well done to that bishop. He's one of the few that stood his ground against the Arian heresy. Epiphanius also mentions the participation of Germanus, bishop of Petra, in 359 AD at the Council of Seleucia. Now, he was put in place when the other bishop was removed, but eventually he got thrown out himself. But you can see that there are bishops of Petra. Okay. Now, usually, when you have a bishop in an area, it means that there's a significant Christian population in the area for that area to get its own bishop. But no, not to Dan Gibson. He thinks that the existence of a bishop in a city doesn't signify all that much. For a bishop to be called to various councils, for Petra to have its own bishop representing itself in councils is significant. There generally were only a few hundred bishops at these councils, so for there to be a bishop of Petra at these councils would suggest that there was a significant Christian population, even if it was a majority at this stage in the 4th century. In fact, it wouldn't have been. Church historian Zozomen, 370 to 450, says Petra was one of the cities where the pagans defended their temples. He uses the words contended zealously. So the Petra pagans were not going to have their temples destroyed without a fight. Zozomen links the destruction of the temples of Petra with the closure of the temple of Serapeum in Alexandria, which strengthened the triumph of Christianity over paganism. These events were dated to 391 AD. So he's saying that the pagans in Petra put up a bit of a fight, but had their temples closed in 391 AD, which is not to say that paganism ended in 391 AD, but you can see the situation that the pagans in Petra were in. They weren't very strong there. It's very hard to argue that they were still a majority. Maybe they were. It seems unlikely. Zozomen's words indicate that there was still a pagan sect in Petra at the beginning of the 5th century. The closure of temples was a consequence of legislation issued by Emperor Theodosis I, prohibiting the practice of pagan rituals in the empire. Now, Petra was under the jurisdiction of the Byzantines, so for Petra to continue to have a majority of pagans from then onwards is very hard to believe. It is very hard to believe, and the evidence, as we'll see, does not support Dan Gibson's case for that. Now, an interesting one, I am familiar with this story, so I only had to write a couple of notes down here for this one. Bishop Barsama of Nisibis, or Nisibis, I think I pronounced it correct. His dates are 419 to 422 AD. I believe those dates are when he visited this area, or maybe it's the time he was bishop, not 100% certain. This is taken from his paper. So he's traveling the lands with 40 monks, and he visits Petra as part of his missionary activity. Now, what happened? So he arrives in Petra, and the people close their gates to him. Okay, so there is still. So he comes up to Petra and he basically says, "Here, let us then open the gates to us. We just have a word of peace to bring you. We're not going to do you any harm." And the people says, we're not letting you in. And he basically has an argument with them about the truth of the Christian message. And so the people basically say, well, it's been a drought here for ages. If you pray to your God and it rains, then we'll be willing to accept it. So he prays with the monks, and it starts to rain, and it's raining for 4 days. And the people then start begging him to ask God to stop the rain because they're going to get flooded out of it. And he says, "I will, if you agree to become Christian and you destroy your pagan idols and so forth." So they agree to that. They destroy the idols and they become Christian. So this is a key moment in Petra's story. This is in the first quarter of the 5th century. So this is literally 2 centuries before the time that Dan Gibson says there was a majority of pagans still in Petra. I've told him about this story. I sent him an email about this about 3 or 4 years ago, but he didn't think this was significant. Um, Now, in addition to that, the paper says it is interesting to note that there is no indication of the presence of pagans in Petra after that date of 422. Okay, that's quite a strong statement. Now he mentions that in 423 AD, Theodosis II issued a decree to stop the destruction of pagan and Jewish temples. This was because this zealous Bishop Barsoma, was going around the lands having pagan temples destroyed and so forth, and I think he was going a bit too far, so Theodosius basically said, hey, hold up, you know. I think there was an appreciation that there's a historical value to these, maybe. Now in 438 he went back on that, and he issued another decree stipulating the destruction of temples. So I don't know, it's a bit of a mess, that one. It's hard to know what Theodosius II was at. Now prior to Bishop Barsoma, Bishop Hilarion, 291 to 371 AD, he also had a role in converting pagans in the Negev. In 350, he converted pagans in the city of Halsa in the Negev. I think it's Negev or Negev. Maybe I'm correct the first time, Negev. He converted many to Christianity through his miracles. The people were worshipping Venus. So the paper argues that when Bishop Barsoma produced this amazing miracle of rainfall after a long drought, that this was cementing the deal for the people of Petra. They were convinced, and that from then onwards paganism was literally just an element. The majority had fully converted to Christianity. Now he goes on to argue that an analysis of archaeological finds and historical sources indicates that the process of transitioning to Christianity was completed among the population during the 6th century AD. Okay? Excavations at Wadi Farasa, 5th century. These are 5th century Greek inscriptions, which include crosses and palm branches, okay, on tombstones. So this is part of the evidence. 4th to the 6th century witnessed a surge in conversion of pagan sites and temples into churches. One example is the Urn tomb. June 24th, 446 AD. There's an inscription there that says, in the time of the most holy Bishop Jason, this place was dedicated to Christ the Saviour. So this urn tomb was converted into a church, and we have the date. So it's June 24th, 446 AD. So this is about 180 years prior to the time that Dan Gibson says that 75% of the population of Petra were still pagan. You also have the royal tomb, Ed Deir, D-E-I-R, hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, maybe it's Ed Deir. That was converted into a monastery. Inscriptions include a set of crosses from the 5th century. So there's quite a lot of evidence, both in terms of archaeological evidence and historical sources, that back this up. Now the paper also goes into the impact of earthquakes on ending paganism in Petra. So we have the miracles and so forth, the constant work of Christian missionaries, but also earthquakes had a major impact on all of this. The earthquake of 363 AD had a huge impact on the pagan presence in Petra. A third of the city was shattered, including the Temple of the Winged Lions, the Great Temple, and the Qasr el-Bent Temple. The earthquake of 419 AD had a big impact. Ruins of these buildings were never restored, and this is just prior to Bishop Barsoma arriving in town. So I think that was the final straw when he convinced them with the miracle of the rain. The paper says that after the transition of the local population to Christianity, the people worked to After the transition of the local population to Christianity, the people worked to rehabilitate and reuse the Khirbet ed Dari and Khirbet el Tanur temples as churches. The construction of the 3 churches that have been discovered so far shows that the Christians aimed to locate their churches in the centre of the city, not in marginal areas far from there. The main church, built between the 4th and 5th century AD, was built in honour of the Blessed and All Holy Lady, the Most Glorious Mother of God and Ever Virgin Mary, as indicated in papyri found in that church. The blue church continued to be used until it was destroyed by the earthquake of 748 AD. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the bishops and monks of Petra wiped out some of the features and aspects of pagan gods in a symbolic gesture, proving that Christianity had vanquished the pagan gods of Petra. Example, images of the goddess Isis carved in Wadi Abu Ulayga were destroyed by hammers, with her heads being broken. Likewise, in the Qatar ad-Dair area, a betel was converted into a cross. How does this indicate pagans were 75% pagan? So, I think it's pretty clear from this paper that we can see a transition from paganism to Christianity. I don't see any evidence for the 75% of the population being Christian at the 7th century. You cannot just look at the pagan sites that are there, which were mostly in ruins by the 7th century. In fact, they were in ruins from the 5th century. You can't count those up and go, oh well, the majority of buildings are pagan, so therefore the majority of the population must have been pagan in the 7th century. That is not how it works. You look at the story of the population in the city, you look at what the historians down through the centuries are saying, you look at the inscriptions, you look at an analysis of the gravestones, the tombstones. The inscriptions in the tombstones in Petra clearly indicate a progression towards Christianity. So I reject Dan Gibson's thesis in relation to the claim that 75% of Petra were still pagan in the 7th century. What do you think? Leave your comments below, and thank you for watching.